Gang for a moment.
All right, thank you very much, Carol. I'm just going to share our slides for this little introduction. Welcome to today's town hall on supplements for people with ALS. You just heard from Carol Hamilton, who I'm sure many of you know well, our Vice President of Development. My name is John Gang. I'm the Communications Manager here at ALS TDI. You might recognize me from some of the articles on our blog, or maybe recognize my voice from our podcast, the Endpoints Podcast, which is available on iTunes and Spotify. Just a little bit about the agenda for today. We are going to start with a quick introduction to ALS TDI. I know we have a lot of questions today for our speakers, so I'm going to try and get through it as quickly as possible. And then we are going to hear from Dr. Jinsy Andrews, the co-chair of the Northeast ALS Consortium and director of neuromuscular trials at Columbia University, and Dr. Merit Sikovich, the director of the Sean M. Healy and AMG Center for ALS and the chief of neurology at Massachusetts General Hospital, and supplements for people with ALS. And then we're going to open things up for a town hall discussion and get to some of your questions. And so a little bit about the ALS Therapy Development Institute. We are the world's most comprehensive drug discovery lab focused solely on ALS. We do not work in any other diseases. And we are also one of the world's first nonprofit biotechs. We were founded in 1999 by the family of Stephen Haywood in their basement in Newton, Massachusetts. Stephen Haywood was diagnosed with ALS at the age of 29, and when his family found out there was no cure or effective treatment for the disease, they decided to do something about it. They were all MIT trained engineers, and they started this institute to research potential treatments. Now, today, more than 20 years later, our scientists have over 300 years of combined experience across all areas of preclinical research. We have a state-of-the-art laboratory in Watertown, Massachusetts, and we put 87 cents of every dollar we raise into that laboratory to find effective treatments and cures for ALS. And just to show you, down in the left-hand corner, that is a picture of our first office in the Haywood's basement. Stephen Haywood is there in the back in the orange shirt. And then on the right, you'll see our old lab in Cambridge, Massachusetts. That is some of our scientists with Stephen Haywood's son. And unfortunately, Stephen Haywood passed away in 2006, but this is still a family affair, and his legacy informs everything that we do here at ALS TDI. Today, we serve as the drug discovery engine for ALS. And what that means is we do the research needed to fill the clinical pipeline for ALS treatments. We know it's going to take many, many treatments to treat ALS because it is a very diverse disease and has many different causes. So we discover and invent drugs in our own laboratory, and we partner to help ensure that these drugs and other drugs advance to human clinical trials. And when we do this, we don't follow the drug into trials. We go back to the drawing board and start again, and we will continue to do this over and over again until everyone with ALS has effective treatments. Now, our impact on ALS, we perform the rigorous research required to discover and invent ALS treatments. Some of the things that we have done include starting the first ALS precision medicine program, which is a partnership with people living with ALS to speed up drug discovery for ALS by collecting data and biological samples from people with ALS. And if you are not already signed up for this program, it is totally free and available to anyone, anywhere in the world. So we highly encourage you to sign up. We have tested over 400 drugs in animal models of ALS, which is more than any other ALS research lab in the world. And we are the first nonprofit biotech to invent a potential ALS treatment, formerly known as AT-1501. It's now known as tegoprubart, and bring it from our own lab through FDA review and into clinical trial, where it just successfully completed a phase 2A study, which we're very excited about. And that brings us to some of our recent news. We are very excited to announce last week that tegoprubart, which is now being developed by Eledon Therapeutics, had a very successful phase 2A study. And then also we recently announced the creation of a artificial intelligence algorithm that is able to analyze voice recordings from people with ALS and report a accurate ALS-FRS voice score. It's an objective digital biomarker for ALS that we hope people will use in the clinic and for research. And also we've released the code for that so that others can see it and potentially improve on it as well. And so, as I said before, we will not be stopping with these achievements, and we will be continuing to look for new therapies. And our objective is to advance a new therapy into human clinical testing every 2 years until everyone with ALS has an effective treatment. So now on to the topic for today. Why we chose this topic to talk about supplements. There's a lot of conflicting and confusing information out there about supplements for ALS, and we get a lot of questions about it. And while we are experts in many areas of ALS, this is an area in which we are not experts in supplements. So we decided to bring in some people who are and are able to talk about this a little more in depth. So with that, I will turn things over to Dr. Jinsy Andrews and Dr. Merit Sikovich.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Carol. It's great to be here. Maybe before we're going to share our slide deck, but before that, I wanted to maybe pass to my co-speaker, Jinsy, if she wanted to say anything.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Merit. It's a pleasure to be here and join Dr. Sikovich in this conversation. I will personally say that this was a tough topic, genuinely, for me. I focus on investigational experimental therapeutics, but as a clinician in the trenches, and I'm sure all of us who treat people living with ALS, we get asked this all the time. And so it was something that we took the time to evaluate, and hopefully this will be helpful. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk today. So I'll go ahead and share. Merit, is there anything else you want to say?
No. Well, while you're putting it up, I'll say that I believe I was at the first fundraiser for ALS TDI in Newton, and it was a belly dancing event. I was not the belly dancer for sure, but it was Jamie's wife.
Oh my gosh, Merit, I didn't know you were there. That's one. We have some great pictures from that. But yes, that was the first. That was really what launched everything.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember it. I've gone to that restaurant. Now it doesn't exist anymore.
I know, Karoon, I miss it.
Yeah. Anyway, so it's great to see the progress and to see that you brought a drug that spun out and had a good phase 2A study. So congratulations on that. But today's topic is supplement and off-label medications, and we're going to share the presentation, but then move right into your questions. Yeah, next slide. It's good. So before jumping into the supplements, we did want to point out that there are approved drugs. I know you all know this, but there are some approved treatments for people with ALS. We have 2 in the United States, Riluzole and Edaravone. And Riluzole has been around since the 90s and reproducible. That every study that's looked at it has shown a small effect, but a real effect on the disease course. And Edaravone, approved in 2017, is an IV treatment antioxidant that slows the illness by about 1/3. And then very recently, a couple of weeks ago, approved by the FDA as an oral drug. I want to just point out that Jinsy and I were on a call with our European colleagues today, and they were really talking that the only drug in Europe is riluzole. And so we do have a lot to do, positive movement in the regulatory world here in the US, but I am very proud that this is an option for people. And I know we're working with our patients to try to get prescriptions in for the oral version of that. We also have some symptomatic treatments. Next slide, please. In particular, Nudexta is approved again in the US and Canada and a few other countries, not in most of Europe, as a treatment for a symptom called pseudobulbar affect. And we had, with our Niels Consortium a while ago, done a study looking at whether it helped bulbar function, in particular speech and swallowing, and that study did show that. But it's officially label is for pseudobulbar affect. So that's what we have on the market, and obviously we need a lot more. The next slide, but there is a lot of progress. I know you guys have seen versions of this slide, but we keep updating them. The ones in green are drugs that have had positive trials on their primary outcome measures. So oral Darvon is now a marketed drug. AMX035 is under FDA review, and that did hit its primary outcome measure. And methylcobalamin it came from 2 studies in Japan. Second one just published showing positive effect on function. So that's good news. And then in blue, we have some treatments that did not hit their primary outcome measures in the trial, but did have important biomarker effects. And there was a recent presentation of some longer term data on tofersen, which is a gene therapy trial for SOD1 that looked very hopeful as well. And then red are some recent trials that did not work. The middle column just shows just a snapshot of some trials that are active right now in what we call late stage, meaning that whether they work on efficacy or not will determine whether they go forward for approval. And then we have more than 250 companies in the ALS space developing treatments. And because of that, we started a platform trial to try to go through that amazing list of potential treatments in a much faster way. And we're hoping, of course, to talk to the company that ALS TDI spun out about their participating in the platform trial as well. So I know that's not what you came to talk about. So we'll move on to supplements and over the counter. And I just wanted to maybe put some definitions there. And as Jency mentioned, we do get asked this a lot, and I know ALS TDI is also asked a lot. Are there supplements or things that are over the counter or off label that people can take, and is there a rationale for them? And so supplements are also known as nutraceuticals. And for example, this could be things like vitamin D or vitamin E. Or I saw there was a question about glutathione, things that are not, in a way, they don't require a prescription. And then there's medications that might be on the market for another reason, but that might have some scientific rationale for in ALS, but they need a prescription. That's called off-label prescription. And one important thing for both of these is that if someone's considering it, you want to have the same rigor of science for supplements and off-label prescriptions as you do for things that are going in trials, because just taking something because it's available is not necessarily helpful, and it could potentially be harmful, and it could also limit options for other things. So it's really important to if you're thinking about a supplement, is to find out about the rationale and the reason, the data behind it, and to really use your medical care team to help with that information in your community. Next slide, please. So, kind of our advice is that before you think about supplements or off-label treatments, to really discuss this with your ALS multidisciplinary team. And because they're hearing these questions, we're talking to each other. We have Rick Bedleck's ALS Untangled, and we can be a real help. And again, if we don't know about the supplement, we can look it up. And that happens to me, I think, on a weekly basis, where someone might ask me something and I might not have heard of it, and I'll look it up and I'll give my opinion if there's information. And if I don't know, I'll say I don't know and try to help to find someone that does know. It's also important to talk not just about the rationale, and it doesn't even make sense to take something, but what are the risks and the benefits? Does it interfere with the things that you're already taking? In particular, some of the marketed drugs and some of the treatment trials. The other thing is to really think about the trials that are out there, which are often, they should be based on really good science and rationale. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing them. And what might or might not be okay as far as supplements for those trials. because you want to make sure that anything you might take doesn't have a negative interaction with the drug in the trial, or have an impact on your ability to be part of that trial. Most trials do allow like people to be on standard of care, and sometimes they allow some of the supplements, but each one's a little different. So you really need to talk to your care team. Next slide, please. We got a few slides from Rick Bedlack, who I hope will come and talk at this series another time. I think everyone knows him as really a leader of really understanding supplements, doing the research through ALS Untangled on the science and the safety, and getting out data that's a free download to anyone thinking about this. And he's really thought a lot about these alternative treatments, whether they're supplements or off-label. And just some words of caution really that come from his experience and our experience is that it's hard to know what's real on the internet. There's a lot of places that advertise things that are probably not true. They'll say things like world's most relied on, clinically proven, guaranteed, and it's hard to sort it out sometimes. And again, this is where working with your teams or looking on ALS Untangled to sort out what's good and what's not good, because there certainly are good things there. It's so hard to tease it apart because it's inundated, I think, by things that probably are not so good. Next slide, please. Anecdotes are all over the internet, and my general philosophy is I don't know where the cure is going to come for this illness, so I'm open to listening to anything, but also with a critical eye, because often anecdotes, you don't know who's writing them, and some of the background. There's been situations where we know that companies have been putting, not legitimate companies, but some companies have been putting up anecdotes that aren't real. I've had companies call my patients, tell them to stop anything that I've given them and take their drug. And that's extreme, but it happens. And again, that's why I think the relationship with your care team is really important to try to sort through what's real, what's not real, what's good and what's not good. We're really here to help. We're not here to block. Also, again, from Rick, some of these alternative medicines are very, very expensive. The most extreme thing, again, I saw someone, charge one of my patients $1 million for a crazy treatment. And now that usually it's not that extreme, but there are, unfortunately, people who try to take advantage of others out there. But they can cost, hundreds and thousands of dollars. They can cause damage and serious side effects. So I think just because something's called a supplement doesn't mean it's safe. And again, my thing is just encourage you to work closely with your team to sort out what's safe and what's not safe. Next slide. These are some of the red flags that Dr. Bedlack put out there about how to tell if something might not be legitimate. And this is on the paper that he put out. That's a free download on his website, ALS Untangled. But some of the red flags are large out-of-pocket costs, saying they've cured many different illnesses, no real data that's made public or published on anything peer-reviewed, or no safety oversight. Typically, if someone's like providing something, charging a lot of money, and you're not providing any consent, and it's not research there, that raises all sorts of red flags. And unfortunately, we see this like every year. There's like many of these out there. But again, there's a lot of good stuff too, and you're going to hear some of the good stuff from Jinsey. But I wanted to at least point you to the a good resource of how to look through these. ALS Untangled is phenomenal. This is really the brainchild of Rick Bedlack, but he's brought a whole community together to write these, to review these, and included the voice of the people living with ALS. So on his website, if you're not familiar with it, please go to it. It describes the method. It has all the completed reviews. It has the future ones that are writing on, and they really look at the supplements. And when he finds something good, then he launches a trial with it, really an online type of trial. He's done a few of those. So I think this is a good way to try to get some of that data on supplements and to help us understand whether something's good or not. With that, I'll pass to Jinsey.
Yeah, thank you, Merritt. I think it's important also to note that a lot of us use the ALS Untangled. Actually, the question that came through the chat today you could have just typed glutathione, ALS Untangled, and you would have gotten the complete summary and the answer right there, written in very clear language and easy to understand language to understand why people might be interested in it. So to Merritt's credit, Merritt helped me with the next few sections as well. So we wanted to just kind of highlight just a few things. One, the data that supports some supplements that people are taking. There are some supplements under investigation and some that we know have been tried in human clinical trials and they just didn't work. And that's kind of to provide a foundation for people to make decisions. And like Merritt mentioned earlier, there are continually new supplements, new combination of supplements that come in, and sometimes we're not familiar, but just having that conversation with your healthcare provider and having someone help you look it up and tease it out is really meaningful, because each person living with ALS has their own preferences about what they want to do, and then their own health medical situation. And you have to kind of gauge that against what potential side effects can be caused by whatever it is they're looking at. So the first one, obviously, that many of you are familiar with is tauroursodeoxycholic acid, otherwise known as TUDCA. This is a small clinical trial that was completed in 2016. It was just 34 patients, but it did show a benefit in a double-blind placebo-controlled trial of TUDCA 1 gram twice daily. Based on this, a larger clinical trial has been launched in Europe that's multi-center and it's ongoing. But secondarily, there was obviously many of you know the Centaur clinical trial that was done with Amylyx and the NEALS Consortium with a combination of sodium phenylbutyrate and tauroursodiol, otherwise referred to as TURSO, which was published in 2020. And obviously the compound, the investigational drug called AMX0035 is currently under review in Canada, in the US, and also in Europe. Additionally, there was a small study that was completed back in 2013. Several people that I help in the ALS clinic are taking acetyl L-carnitine based on this multi-center double-blind placebo-controlled trial. And this was just 82 patients randomized 1-to-1, and the acetyl L-carnitine dose was 1 gram 3 times a day. But this probably needs verification in a larger trial to understand efficacy. Now, remember, many of you are already familiar with phases of clinical trial. When you do these, a lot of the supplements that have some clinical trial data have completed some early testing, which demonstrates good safety and tolerability, but sometimes need additional data collected in a larger study to understand its true efficacy in ALS. And other small studies, so there are smaller studies that were conducted with biotin. This was, I believe, a trial that was a single center, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. There was only 30 patients in it. But again, the authors concluded that it was safe and well tolerated, but larger studies were warranted to determine efficacy. This was just published in 2020. I think the senior author was Dr. Camus. And then the second study was in L-serine. This was a single center study, actually just randomly assigning 4 different doses of L-serine, so low to high dose, and it was shown to be safe. But again, this also concluded that a larger study was warranted to determine efficacy. So some individuals have looked at this study and have chosen to take L-serine. And L-serine is actually being studied at the highest dose that was previously studied at 15 grams. And that's a small study, that's a larger study out of the US, but these are the supplements that are currently being evaluated in clinical trials as of today. So I had to actually go into, if something is not here, it's not on clinicaltrials.gov. So this required, and every time I do a presentation, I have to do it the day of and do a search through multiple databases and look at interventional trials. So I had 496 hits as of today on interventional trials, and then scour individually to find which ones included dietary supplements. And so this was a set that came through with their NCT numbers that are active. So TUDCA, as you know, is a multi-center trial that's ongoing in Europe. Curcumin has fully enrolled and it's active and ongoing. So this is the one out of Dr. Bedlack's site in Duke. And then there's a smaller phase 2 study looking at what people have referred to as ashwagandha. So actually it's an Ayurvedic medicine out of India, but it's also referred to as Withania somnifera, which I did not realize until I had to prepare for this presentation. But it is looking at a biomarker and looking at a dose of 1,088 milligrams daily of an extract. And that's being done out of Canada and is actively recruiting. Lipoic acid, there's been a lot of preclinical studies with lipoic acid, but there's a larger study being done in China that's recruiting using intravenous lipoic acid to see if it has a neuroprotective effect and looking at efficacy outcome measures. And then the last one on that list is nicotinamide and pterostilbene. I don't know if I said that correctly, but that is almost like a related compound to resveratrol, which a lot of people have access to over the counter. And that is also underway in Norway. So we are collecting data from those particular supplements because they have some scientific rationale, some evidence in the preclinical setting, and now moving into human clinical trials. There are some that we have actually studied in human clinical trials that had negative trial results. And so this list here, specifically in terms of ALS and its efficacy. So, you know, coenzyme Q10 has probably other benefits in other issues or medical issues, but for ALS, it was studied in a large clinical trial and it didn't show efficacy as did vitamin E and creatine and lunasin. So those are things that typically we don't necessarily recommend. But I did want to highlight, and both of us actually talked about supplements. People take them, they're easily accessible. We wanted to make sure that you are aware that sometimes taking them can be exclusionary in clinical trials. So this is not true of every clinical trial, but it's important to be aware that when you take some of these things that are being studied actively or are actually have some preliminary data, they could be excluded. So things like curcumin or therakermin, methylcobalamin, TUDCA, basis, L-serine, these are just some, but any supplement that's an active clinical trial or investigation may be excluded. And really remember, at the end of the day, when a clinical trial is running with an experimental therapeutic, we're trying to find the answer of whether it helps you or not. And so taking things that might cloud that ability to judge that efficacy will slow down the development of whatever we might be evaluating, and we can't get it out there faster to people, to everyone living with ALS. Same is true of off-label prescriptions. So these are things that are in clinical trials or being studied actively. And so not only is the issue of clouding efficacy when we're trying to evaluate an investigational drug, but also we might not know how an experimental therapy might interact with that off-label prescription. So there's safety issues too that can occur. So typically, if anything's in clinical trials, it's usually excluded. So this also can vary from trial to trial, depending on the mechanism of action of that experimental drug or the landscape at that time when the clinical trial launches. Now, the last thing I wanted to kind of conclude on are things to consider. Now, Merritt mentioned earlier, just because it's a dietary supplement doesn't necessarily mean it's always safe. So I kind of wanted to just highlight things. These are things that are commonly people ask me about in the clinic, and we talk about it, and I've looked it up, and they can cause some issues. So I did want to make sure that we did talk about some side effects. So TUDCA, many people that I'm seeing in New York are taking the TUDCA over-the-counter supplement, and it's really well known about the upset stomach or diarrhea or loose stool for certain individuals that are sensitive to it. Vitamin D and E are fat-soluble vitamins, and high levels can be toxic. So it's important to get, if you're taking additional vitamin D or additional vitamin E, you should get your levels checked. In very high levels, vitamin D can disturb your calcium balance. It can cause increased weakness and even kidney stones. I've actually had this happen. More recently, I actually had a young man in his 40s. He's a physician. He fell, he allowed me to share the story, but he fell and didn't have any laceration or bruise, but didn't feel right. Went to bed the next day, didn't feel good, called me. I sent him to the hospital. He had a large bleed. And in reviewing things that he was taking vitamin E, and it might have been the reason why there was so much blood from just a simple fall. So vitamin E can cause increased risk of bleeding. B6 is pyridoxine. And I only put this here because a lot of people are interested in taking B12, and methylcobalamin is a formulation of B12. And the studies from Japan looked at the injected form, and that does require a prescription, but just so you know, insurance companies don't cover it typically. And so that's an out-of-pocket expense that requires a prescription. But B12, sometimes people will try to take it orally, and it's combined with a lot of other B vitamins. So people will take B complex, and I certainly have had people with really high elevated B6 levels with actually peripheral painful neuropathy. And those levels can be checked as well. Some people, there's less evidence out there on some of these, selenium and magnesium and fish oil, but selenium definitely in high levels can cause significant toxicity. And so it's pretty important to ensure that you're not taking too much selenium, because it can cause things like brittle nails and loss of hair, but in really, really, really extreme high doses, it can affect the heart and the kidneys. And magnesium too in high levels can cause muscle weakness and low blood pressure and flushing of the face. L-serine, the doses that are being studied are 15 grams per day, but some people can take higher doses, and that can cause GI issues and visual changes in extreme high doses. In some of the other rare diseases, people have noticed seizures. And then fish oil is pretty well tolerated. It can cause stomach upset and loose stool. There's debatable literature, and this has gone back and forth in JAMA and some of the big publications about whether it thins blood or not, as it's used also in cardiovascular disease. And then the other thing that I wanted to emphasize is that some supplements and some alternative therapies may not have a lot or any scientific rationale or efficacy data. But if that's the case and someone's interested in it, you have to take the same approach as when you're looking at an experimental therapy in a clinical trial, like when you're evaluating it. So you got to ask those same questions. Just because you can buy it over the counter, is it worth it? Is it worth is it worth taking it? Is there good rationale? What's the science behind why that supplement would be taken? What mechanism would it be theoretically targeting? Has it been tested in lab models? That gives you a little bit more confidence. Has it been tested in people? That gives you a little bit more confidence. And then what are the risks? So if there's a supplement out there that you take and it raises your blood sugar, but you have a history of diabetes, that could not be potentially beneficial for you. So it's important to kind of take that rigor and really ask hard questions. And this goes for everything, not just supplements, but alternative therapies, off-label prescriptions. Really ask those questions to the people offering it to you or presenting it to you as a possibility. I did want to point out that I did run into this. Some supplements can interfere with medical testing. And so specifically biotin, I've had people take biotin supplements, and my endocrine colleagues, I've sent several people living with ALS to endocrine because they had high thyroid or high TSH, low TSH, and it apparently interferes heavily with thyroid labs specifically. But any biotin-related assays, and there are many assays, especially in the endocrine field, biotin can affect it. So my endocrine colleagues have told me to take people off before we test those things. And the last is whenever you're buying something over the counter, it's important to check the label. And usually if you're purchasing something online, you'll see the supplement and then you should see the back label. If you don't see the label, don't buy it. And I'll tell you why, because I've had people purchase, for example, Tudka, and then they come in telling me that they're very sleepy. And then sure enough, I had an instance where the Tudka, when they brought in the bottle, when I turn it over, it's combined with melatonin. So they were taking high levels of this Tudka, but also high levels of melatonin. They were extremely sleepy. So just check the back label before you purchase something. So I covered a lot of ground, and I wanted to just summarize, obviously the first step is connecting with your multidisciplinary clinic, talking about the FDA approved therapies and symptomatic management. I can't overemphasize every lecture that I've given. I always talk about the underappreciation for non-pharmacological treatment like nutritional care, respiratory care, rehabilitative care, because it improves quality of life and survival. And then also reviewing and considering clinical trials if that opportunity is available to you. But if you're not eligible for clinical trials and you've got everything squared away in terms of your clinical team that takes care of you, you reviewed the approved therapies and you're hooked in, then it then becomes an opportunity to talk about other options, gaining access to investigational therapies outside of a clinical trial or alternative therapies. But it's really important to talk about those risks and benefits. And like you saw earlier, it's not just about the side effects of a therapy, but how much it costs and how it could impact you, how it could impact your caregivers, your family, and your social life and your quality of life. So that's all important when you take into consideration anything that you want to pursue to care for yourself. So with that, I'll stop and probably give us a chance to have some ability to answer some questions.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. I think that this was really valuable because I know that people think of vitamins as harmless, right? And you can just pop them. So I think the message of making sure that everybody speaks with their clinician and their team is huge. And I do have a few questions. And the first one, I know you both have answered before, but if you would do us the favor, this question came from a registration, which is the TUDCA I get from, say, Amazon retail the same as the TUDCA that was used in the Amylyx trial that I know is manufactured in Europe? And should I take TUDCA while we now wait for AMX 0035 to hopefully be approved later in the year?
I'm happy to try to start. So there is a worldwide patent on TUDCA, and it comes from a group in Italy. And so I believe that every TUDCA you buy comes from there. But what we don't know is when you buy things at a health food store or on Amazon, what else is in there and the percent purity and all that, because it's not really a controlled area, the whole nutraceutical area. But I think that if there's TUDCA in there, it's from the same place, I guess would be that answer. I'd say the decision about whether to take TUDCA or not on your own is one you really need to discuss with your physician. And for a couple of reasons, it does have side effects. We don't know if TUDCA alone is effective. We only know the combination, really. That was a well-done study with the sodium phenylbutyrate. We'll know soon if TUDCA alone is sufficient, but the small study that Jinsey showed there was in fact a small study. So I don't, but you have to discuss it with your doctors. It will, right now it is exclusionary from most trials because it's considered experimental. Not all, but most trials.
Awesome, thank you. I thought this was a really neat question. Are there supplements that have rationale to be considered as potentially helpful in different types of ALS, like familial versus sporadic or bulbar versus limb onset?
That's a great question. I'll start. It's probably one of the toughest questions, but when we talk about ALS in general, ALS, we know now that there are different cohorts within it. We know, we all kind of acknowledge that people living with ALS, they're different from one another, and there's different groups and different ways that it presents and different progression patterns. And there are some that are caused by genetic mutations, some that are sporadic. And it's probably likely that there are different mechanisms that are predominant in different cohorts of people living with ALS. So for example, maybe there's a group that has excessive glutamate and excitotoxicity as their predominating situation. Some of the gene mutations do produce toxic abnormal proteins and maybe things that help clear those proteins out of the motor neurons or promote what we call autophagy might be beneficial. Or there might be a group that has predominant neuroinflammation. We don't actually have a way of checking, one of the things is we don't have a way of actually checking, right, that's your predominant mechanism. So you're taking a guess really as to what might be the best way to approach your disease. I dream of a time when we could check a biomarker and classify people in that category, like, oh, you have a lot of oxidative stress, so an antioxidant would be really beneficial for you. And I think we're heading in that direction. But I think right now it's really hard to kind of pick and choose when we can't really measure what it is that's really dominant in a person's disease.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the biggest problems all the way around, right? Another great one, I think, is how would I know if a supplement is helping me or not?
That's a really good question. I don't know that you'll know right now, but we have to get to that point in ALS. And if, for example, we had a biomarker, something like, for example, cholesterol, you take your cholesterol lowering drug and you measure your cholesterol and you know it's working for you. If we had something like that, then we could do much faster trials we could do these N of 1 studies. So but the field of ALS is trying to develop those tools, and I'm hopeful that it'll be figured out. And that's the advantage of having these huge biobanks of fluids and lots of scientists studying it and lots of good clinical data with it, so that we can find what I call our cholesterol.
Yeah, and what I will add is, there are. ideally, if there was something I could measure, like, any biomarker, and you start it, we get a baseline, you start something, and then we can measure it after. That's the N of 1 that Merritt's just talking about. But on the flip side of things, I have had people, usually people who pursue supplements have tried and exhausted all other options. So I have a historical change of their functional rating scale or their breathing. And crudely, we can measure that after they start something and look at the slope of change. But on a rare occasion, so often I can't see a difference, but on a rare occasion, I do see someone who does do a little bit worse. And that sometimes does give me an indication. And we have a talk that whether we want to continue it or not, and I'll show the line. So that has happened with certain off-label types of treatments and even supplements, because it might have irritated some medical history that the person or the individual might have had. So, we have crude ways of doing it, but really, as Merritt said, if we had a marker, that would be like the ideal.
Certainly would. We are, and to answer your question, Lori, in combination with that, I saw it just pop up on my screen, and I apologize. There will be some that I will miss in the chat, and we will get back to you on those. But Lori, the blood collection, the quarterly blood collection from TDI's PMP is to look at changes in biomarker and compare it, biomarkers, blood-based biomarkers, and compare it to the rest of the comprehensive data that's collected in the program. So I think there is agreement, most likely across the board, that identifying potential biomarkers is critical here. Are there, one of the other kind of themes that came up quite a bit in the pre-registration questions was the Deanna protocol. And another question was around dietary recommendations. Do either one of you want to talk about kind of that generally?
Yeah, I can weigh in on what I share with people I care for who ask me about this. I say that we do not know if it works or not. And it's unfortunate because it's been around for a long time and someone could have done a study of it, but we don't know if it worked. I've looked at the different components. I don't see anything that's unsafe on that. So then again, it comes down to whether it's okay in a trial or not. And if someone wants to do a trial and it's fine, then if someone wants to do that, it's fine. If it, so it's a discussion, but we have no efficacy data on that protocol.
Yeah, I second that. It's been challenging because, there are people's experiences on it that's shared, but we don't really have objective data to see if it actually has a benefit and who it would benefit the most. But the risks, when you look at the individual ingredients, are fairly low, but again, it could compromise your eligibility for clinical trials. And so you would have to make sure you talk with your healthcare team, if you were interested in clinical trials. The dietary thing, I think, is a complicated, actually, it's not a complicated question. I think it gets complicated, but it's not really as complex as it seems, because every ALS clinic actually has a dietitian or tries to get nutritional assessments done, because we know that maintaining weight is very important, and that when people do lose weight, especially rapidly, it does have a negative impact on their disease progression. You lose weight quickly, disease progresses quickly, so much so that actually from a regulatory perspective, regulatory agencies will view rapid weight loss as a negative side effect of an investigational product. So weight maintenance in general is super important in ALS, as much as it is in a lot of other neuromuscular disorders. But there are a lot of questions that I get asked often about, whether a plant-based diet, paleo diet, gluten-free, lactose-free diet, are they helpful? And honestly, our dietitian will counsel people according to what their lifestyle practices are and what their preferences are. But ultimately, if those are the choices you make, you have to make sure that when you're doing it, you're not losing weight. I didn't need a clinical trial to tell me that losing weight causes a negative impact on the disease. You can clearly see it. You don't need a study. So that's why I think it's very important for people to understand, you can control your diet in any which way. I don't think there is a standard recommendation of doing an anti-inflammatory diet, for example, is another new one that I get asked. I think it's maintaining your weight at all costs.
Thank you. And tangentially, I'm just going to read it. Does glutamate in our diet make ALS worse? And does glutamine supplementation potentially increase glutamate levels in people with ALS?
I can try to answer. I don't think what you take in your diet for glutamate will affect your ALS or your glutamate level of transmission in your brain. It's such a tightly controlled system in your brain of the glutamate, that how much is released, how much uptaken, it's not affected by your oral intake.
And I was going to say that your body has a very, as Merritt mentioned, is a very tightly regulated, and that you can't have too little, you can't have too much. And so there's a strong regulatory mechanism in your body to keep that in a certain range.
Emily or Nadia or anyone who's had the opportunity to monitor the chat better than I have for the last few minutes, do you want to pull a question or two out before we sign off? And again, everyone who is on here who has asked a question, we will get back to you and make sure we get you an answer if we were unable to answer it in this hour.
I've seen several questions on lion's mane. Are there any thoughts on lion's mane?
It's a newer one. Yeah. Lion's mane. I've had several people ask about that. And again, we don't have a lot of objective data for its efficacy, but the rationale and the risks are fairly low, but we don't really have any evidence that it actually is beneficial.
Yeah, we need to vote for that ALS Untangled so they can do a review of it. It's in their future review category. Yeah.
I think somebody also mentioned that that lion's mane might increase levels of NGF and BDNF. And have there been any studies that show that those two things might help with ALS?
In the 90s, there were a lot of studies with growth factors like BDNF, and they were all negative. And so I think it's again a much more complex approach of how do you deliver those growth factors to the neurons. And I don't think that, personally, don't think that lion's mane is going to do very much.
Yeah, the growth factors have always been a hot topic in terms of preclinical research, but they're complex proteins, right? And so they have to, if you take it orally, it has to be absorbed through your GI system, then get into your peripheral blood, and then cross the blood-brain barrier. It's very tough for that to occur. So, I think some of it is the way you get it and how you get it and what you get. So I agree. I wanted to jump in. There was a question about genes, looking at genes globally. It says, can you recommend what genes to look for around the world in order to improve trials combining with gene counseling? I did want to just squeeze in there that there is an international consortium for gene testing and genetic counseling to make it accessible globally. So this is not just Europe, Canada, and US, but just globally. We're looking at Asian countries, African countries, and trying to get it everywhere. And typically, there is a consensus that testing for genes, especially the ones that have investigational therapy, that's under evaluation. So, for example, SOD1, C9, the FUS gene is actually there's an active clinical trial recruiting at the moment, and it's really hard to find. And there is a clinical trial evaluating ataxin-2, which is a risk gene. It's not like it's different from the others, but there will be more. So that, I think, will pressure the need to do the testing. Of course, these things have to be done with genetic counseling because it can affect, obviously, not only the person living with the symptoms of ALS, but also their family members. So it's really important to be informed when you get the tests. It also will help us understand, like, if there's people who respond preferentially to clinical trials as well.
We have just a few minutes left, so I wanted to offer the two presenters the opportunity to summarize anything last minute before we hard stop you.
Sure. First of all, thank you for inviting us. It's been a great discussion. I wish we could get to all the questions. I think my takeaway is that there's just an incredible amount of science and collaboration going on in the world between people living with the illness, foundations and investigators. And I don't know where the answers are going to come from, but I am very hopeful that given this amount of attention to this illness, we're going to get really meaningful treatments. Whether it's going to be supplements or not, I don't know, but please just consider the rigor of anything you put in your body, that there's a scientific rationale and it's safe. And please use your care team. And if they're not helping you, I know it sounds bad, but get another care team. You really need to be in a partnership with your care team so that you can do the things that are good for you and also safe.
Completely second that.
Yeah. Great. John, anything I missed?
I think we are all good.
Aside from a gazillion great questions, we will, like I said, we will get back to you. Remember too that the topic for this was supplements. So that's our focus. And those are the confines that we hope to be able to answer your questions around. But we will absolutely get back to you.
Yeah, this is a big topic. And, there's so much. I know we couldn't get to everything, but, this should be like part 1. You should do a part 2.
Okay. Are you guys raising your hands to help?
And hey, whatever helps. And, get Dr. Bedlack in here too, because half the questions in the chat could have been answered if you just typed that compound and ALS Untangled.
Yes.
Or you can propose it as a next review. So, the power is here for you guys.
Yep. Yes, please take advantage of that because it's an incredible resource and you can help make it that much more robust by making those recommendations.
And maybe we should just add to that our precision medicine program that we mentioned earlier. You do get a dashboard where you can see all of the data that you're providing, which is a great way to keep track of whether any supplements or things that you're trying are potentially having some kind of effect. So just another reason to sign up for that if you haven't already.
Cool. And here come the thank yous. Great. Close us out, John?
Sure. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We will be sending you a follow-up survey, as Carol said. If you'd like to see any additional resources, we have them on our website at www.als.net/resources. And we appreciate you joining us today, and keep in touch.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much.